learning outcomes. After studying this module, you should be able to understand the origin of Buddhism, know about the teachings of the Buddha, learn about the three characteristics of existence, analyze the Four Noble Truths. Introduction. Buddha Vachna, or what is referred to as the original teachings or word of the Buddha, has been the issue of deliberation and historical argument for centuries. These basic teachings have given rise to the several schools and traditions of Buddhism that are prevalent today. The originator of this philosophy in this sphere was Buddha, who existed as well as gave teachings in India dating back to somewhere 2,500 years ago. Meanwhile, then billions of individuals all over the place in the domain have pursued the divine trail he discovered. The Buddhist mode of life of harmony, adoring compassion, as well as understanding is a vital currently as it was in the earlier period. Buddha illuminated that all our difficulties as well as distress rise from the muddled as well as destructive stages of awareness, as well as that everybody's contentment as well as worthy affluence rise from serene and optimistic state of mind. The teachings of Buddha. The Buddha's teachings, preserved initially through an oral tradition, were eventually written down in the form of three collections or baskets known as Tripitaka. The older version of these is believed to have been written in Pali, an ancient Indian language. It constitutes the scriptures of one of the two main branches of Buddhism, sometimes called the Hinayan or small vehicle, and represented by the Triveda school, dominated today in Southeast Asia. The other branch, the Mahayana, uses primarily the Sanskrit version of Tripitaka. The total number of scriptures in Buddhism surpasses 85,000, a massive body of literature. Mahayana or Great Vehicle Buddhism is dominant in East Asia. Zen belongs to the Mahayana tradition, developing from roots in India through the filters of Taoism in China, passing from there to Korea and Japan and to the rest of the world. A primary difference between Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism lies in their ideals of personal development. The former stresses renunciation of worldly life and a monastic lifestyle. The latter accepts that enlightenment is possible also for lay practitioners. Its ideal is Bodhisattva, a person who vows to dedicate life to the salvation of all sentient beings, not accepting full liberation until all others are free from sufferings. Of the two key virtues in Buddhism, wisdom and compassion, Hinayan stresses the former, while Mahayana stresses the latter. Some of the key teachings of the Buddha are the three characteristics of existence, that is, the Four Noble Truths, 8 eightfold path, karma, interdependent originations, and the five aggregates, which we would be discussing in detail now. The three characteristics of existence, the three widespread physiognomics of way of life are an integral share of the philosophy of the Buddha. It is a teaching of early Buddhism which is recognized by all Buddhist schools. Similar to the Four Noble Truths, karma, codependent initiation, as well as the collections, the philosophy of the three features is measure of what one refers to as the doctrine subject matter of wisdom. His own experiences originated from his personal opinions as well as ruminations. In addition, he insisted everybody to realize as well as determine them from our own selves. In the midst of his furthermost central knowledge is that of the three characters of existence or the three dharma seals. All facets of our existence, beginning from the bodily to the inner to the divine, all are related to these features. Evolving a profound considerate of these is the source for understanding on the Buddhist track. After much meditation, the Buddha determined that all things in the physical world and all the things in the phenomenology of psychology is marked by these three characteristics. A characteristic is to some degree essentially associated by means of approximately some other things. Since a feature is essentially associated with something, thus it helps us in knowing the character of that thing. Therefore, in this testimony that the Buddha uses the word characteristic to bring up to evidence about the nature of existence that are at all times connected with existence or always found in existence. Thus, when the Buddha thought that there are three characteristics of existence, he referred to these characteristics as always present in existence and that they help us understand what to do with existence. The Buddha observed that there are three characteristics of all knowing phenomenon, that is anicca or impairments, dukkha or suffering, and ananta or the no self. These characteristics are common to all things, both living and non-living. They must be subject to these three characteristics. The Buddha explained these when he became enlightened and taught people as follows. These characteristics are discussed below. First, anicca, impairments. Anicca is a Pali word which is composed of two joint words, nika and the privative particle ansa, which refers to the idea of permanence, of continuity. Anicca means the lack of continuity, the lack of permanence, the law of transience, conditions that altogether occurrences are focused to continue change, to upswing as well as to descend, as well as to no perpetual situations. Moreover, bodily or animate be existent. In other words, not anything ever stops to be present. It merely alterations procedure. It is understood in both our physical and psychological life, that is, understood in our internal life, in our feelings as well as views. If we perceive our concentrations besides dispositions are understand that they are in a persistent state of measure as well as alteration. Besides that, we can usually ever barely recollect the sentiments of opinions we experienced so intensely at a former period. Together, inclination as well as discomfort, besides the lot in between, are temporary. Cognizance as well as reflection training benefit us to appreciate this openly for an individual. As soon as an individual perceives one's concentration, we comprehend how all assumed rises, highlights our consideration, and then dies away. If we observe the physical world, we can determine anicca, marks all marvels there as well. Second, dukkha or suffering. Dukkha means sorrow, pain, and suffering. It is a foremost characteristic in the domain in which we live. The law of dukkha refers to all complex occurrences are in the concluding exploration insufficient. The Buddha assumed that the simple fact of living is distinct by the characteristic of dukkha, which is suffering, establishing in all its forms. It can be the sorrow that one experiences in sadness, in the misery, or the problems of this life. It can also be the sorrow that can be felt when one is flooded with pleasure, to the fact that the object of pleasure, that one becomes repulsive. It relates to the discomfort to be detached from those we love, but it is also that of having to tolerate the occurrence of those whom we do not love. It is the agony of not living in place where we would like to live, and also that of presence in force to live in places where we do not want to live, in one way or the other, whether we want it or not. Frequent situations in which we find ourselves are painful from time to time. Because of this affirmation, the Buddha's teachings are reproached of being pessimistic, and sometimes it is said that the world is not so painful because there is hope. Nevertheless, dukkha makes sure of not merely denote to agonizing as well as difficult experiences. It talk about the point that anicca, no loan, accomplishment, control, or life circumstances can eventually take along as enduring contentment. We may comprehend phases of delight centered on these effects, but because that joy is reliant on outward wonder, it will finally culminate. An individual's mind has a normal acquisitive worth. It is continuously affecting on to the subsequent entity of connection. When it is not doing this, it is expended by means of hiding not here that which we don't desire or grouchy around it, to accomplish factual lifelong contentment, pleasure not reliant on continuously our instinct to minute conditions. We ought to disrupt the series of dukkha. An in-depth accepting of dukkha is at the core of the Buddha's traditions on the Four Noble Truths, the basis training of Buddhism. Third, ananta or no self. The third characteristic is non self or selflessness. The third law asserts that at hand is no enduring identity, individuality, or depth in occurrences. The duration brings about as the denial of the conception of atta, that is, atma, that to an extent is similar in the long standing faith of the Buddha's time to anything additional beliefs have referred to the humanity. The Buddha innovative psychobio description of the person which has underlined any place for the depth. The Buddha accepted that the misapprehension of one's identity or character is considered as the main aspect related to the drives associated with the individual, as well as the similar period, one of the maximum effective foundations of lack of knowledge, in addition to incorrect act. In spreading the ananta principles to the occurrences of the peripheral world round about, precaution must take into account. In the initial Buddhism doesn't reject the truth which is associated to the surroundings which are outside one's being. It claimed that the phenomenon of the outside domain may possibly be disrupted, interested in its basic mechanisms, as well as that non-entity besides this, none of the other constituents should be available. It remained simply in this aspect that the portents of the outside domain were professed to be void, which is referred to as Suna. Few of the schools of Mahayana Buddhism have taken the policy of vacancy, Sunana, to suggest a renunciation of the authenticity of the peripheral domain. This understanding is unknown to initial Buddhism. Initial Buddhism merely proclaimed that there is no static core or existence in potence, nevertheless, simply a procedure of becoming bhava, rendering to Buddha in the long run. Non-entity has an absolute essential quintessence. The whole thing is comprised of energy combined in diverse bodily, rational, expressive or mystical constructions to make the advent of firmness as well as immutability on the sophisticated domain. On the other hand, at the central of these arrangements, there is anything there. It is also applicable to our private persons as well. In addition, this teaching of having not an identity is one of the fundamental variations which is there amid Buddhism, as well as supplementary faiths that suggest a perpetual feeling or essence. This is the aspect that differentiates Buddhist traditions on Renaissance in relation to other models of reincarnation. According to them, individual is continuously undergoing changes which are range of dynamics. As soon as we realize this on our own, then one can forego one's affection toward knowledge of oneself as an inadequate self. These three characteristics are viewed as the basic aspects one should be able to recognize as well as comprehend. The initial aspect, which comprises of transience as well as misery, appear as if they are simple to recognize for the reason that they are noticeable easily by oneself, as it is we who transform, as well as for the reason related to the fluidity in few occasions we cannot stand. It results in one having the misinterpret the trainings of the Buddha. So it is very significant that we realize such important issues of this philosophy. The Buddha's explanation to the problem of suffering has been referred to as the most important psychological discovery of all times. Mosig 1989. It represents an application of the far reaching principles of dependent origination, which says that suffering is the result of causal conditions, and if suffering is to cease, those conditions must cease. The Buddha's solution was articulated in the system of Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are an outcome from the presentation of the three elementary rules to the social circumstances. He often emphasized that he was concerned in the difficulty of the lessening of the individual distress. Merely, it emphasizes on one aspect, that is misery, as well as by what means to culminate. His methodology to the difficulty related to the anguish was in association of that of the doctor to his patient. Initially, it was to analyze the difficulty, then try to find the reason of the difficulty, subsequent discovering out if possibility of a remedy is conceivable. The Four Noble Truths are an eventuality organization aimed at handling effectively with the anguish human experiences. It deals with grief of a bodily type or of an emotional aspect. The experiences on the Four Noble Truths are almost the precise initial of a lot of lessons that Sukhumani Buddha provided in Sarnath, close to Benares or Varanasi in India. Few weeks after accomplishing enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, these lessons are recognized to comprise the core of the Buddhist path, irrespective of the ritual one charts. The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism are the core as well as fundamental of the Buddha's teaching and dharma. When understood, they lead to your comprehension and developing. 2500 years ago, Siddhartha Gautam comprehended the magnitude and definitive influence of these Four Noble Truths. These Noble Truths are what he stimulated to grasp this teaching is to cognize the human conditions for all societies and cultures across the planet. Actually, understanding the nature of these truths is critical to eradicating pain, discomfort, and stress in your life. The Four Noble Truths include the core of Buddha's lessons. All the same, they leave greatly left inexplicable, and the Four Noble Truths are: first, the reality of sorrow, which is referred to as dukkha. Second, the truth of the reasons behind misery, which is referred to as samudaya. Third, the actuality of the culmination of anguish, which is referred to as nirodha. Fourth, the truth of the root that relates us from distress, that is referred to as maga. The truth of suffering or dukkha. The truth of suffering is the first noble truth, which very often is explained as life is suffering. A lot of individuals new to Buddhism become apprehensive as they perceive this. On the other hand, the Pali terminology dukkha too denotes to anything that is passing, provisional, or compounded of other things. Even to some degree, precious and enjoyable is dukkha because it will end. In other words, it means that suffering is common to all. Everybody suffers from it. For instance, as soon as one comes into being, they cry. While one falls ill, they are dejected. When one comes of age, they would have throbbing as well as troubles. In addition, they would discover it becomes difficult to move around. Nobody of us wants to perish. We sense profound grief when somebody expires. Some of the additional aspects we agonize from are nobody likes to be with those we hate, being separated from persons we have affection, not attaining what we want, and various types of difficulties as well as dissatisfactions that are inevitable. The Buddha did not reject that there is happiness in life, but he stated that it does not last forever. In due course, everybody does experience some type of misery. He supposed that, inverted commas, at hand is contentment in life, pleasure is present in forming bond, delighted of a family, contentment in a fit body as well as mind. Nevertheless, when one loses them, there is distress. The truth of dukkha discusses not to be on existence of the pleasing as well as the aesthetic, but to the actual not having completed and finished of that enjoyment. The assertion of pessimism, sometimes made of early Buddhism, is without basis. Anguish, in the Buddhist sense, covers what is usually termed evil in other religion philosophical schemes, and the presence of evil triggered either by chance events or by deliberate ill will is not really left without. Second, the truth of the cause of suffering, samudaya. The reason of sorrow is related to the subsequent truth. The Buddha elucidated that people suffer because of lack of knowledge and ignorance. The immediate source of sorrow is longing, that is tanha, but the source of root is unawareness, that is avijja. The matters of craving are diverse: sensual desires, material possessions, glory, power, fame, ego, craving for rebirth, even craving for nibbana. There are numerous amounts of yearnings from a minor aspiration to a severe acquisitive. Craving is the immediate cause of suffering and is initiated by other conditioned factors. We frequently explore for to some degree look outside ourselves to make us happy. But no matter how successful we are, we under no situations endure content. Then we feel unsatisfied when the world doesn't behave the way we think it should have ended up. Then we feel unsatisfied. Follow to our outlook. The Buddha's teaching on karma and rebirth are carefully linked to the second noble truth. Third, the truth of the cessation of suffering. The cause of suffering could be stabilized. This truth asserts that a way out of suffering occurs, which, if monitored, will lead the individual to a state of non suffering. Buddhists call the state in which all suffering is ended nirvana. Nirvana is an eternal state of boundless bliss and peace. The Buddha said, the elimination of desire is nirvana. This is the eventual objective in Buddhism. Even person can comprehend it with the help of the Buddha's teaching. It can be experienced in this very life. Fourth, the truth of the path to enlightenment. The Buddhist route to enlightenment is that revealed by the Buddha through his own personal effort and practice. It has been known as the middle path for the reason that it is a medium between the extremes of self indulgence and self mortification. Both extremes of practice were common in Buddha's day. The Buddha calls such extreme vain, profitless, and dishonorable. The path of the Buddha evades two types of action, typically measured vital for salvation by numerous religious systems. These are prayers to suprahuman powers and agencies and elaborate rites and rituals. On the other hand, these are well thought out as being positive obstacles on the path to the termination of suffering and the attainment of insight and wisdom. The path to end suffering is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths consist of the central features of Buddha's teachings. Though they leave much left incomprehensible, they are the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that can result in ending the suffering. Further, it states that suffering is real. It has a cause, it has an end, and it has a cause to bring about its end. The belief of suffering is not proposed to express a negative worldview, but somewhat a realistic perspective that deals with the world as it is and endeavors to resolve it. The idea of pleasure is not deprived. Pursuit of pleasure can only carry on what it eventually is unappeasable desire. Summary. Buddha illuminated that individuals' difficulties as well as anguish generates from perplexed as well as destructive status of mind, as well as that all our pleasures, in addition to good fortune, rise from serene as well as conclusive feelings. The Buddha's teachings, preserved initially through an oral tradition, were eventually written down in the form of three collections of basket. Some of the key teachings of the Buddha are the three characteristics of existence, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, Karma, Interdependent Origination, and the five aggregates. The three characteristics of existence are Anika, Dukkha, and Ananta. These three characteristics are viewed as the basic things that Buddhists should know and comprehend. The first two, impairments, and suffering appear to be easy to recognize. Without the accepting of these characteristics, we may misinterpret the teachings of the Buddha. So, it is very significant that we realize these important factors of Buddhism. The Buddha's solution to the problem of suffering was expressed in the form of Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths consist of central features of Buddha's teaching. Though they leave much left incomprehensible, they are the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that can result in ending the suffering.